Okay, this is Lecture 8, Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at personality and Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. So the first part of the lecture is going to be about personality development across the lifespan. And basically, what is meant about personality is the idea that there are certain qualities, characteristics about an individual that appear to be stable across time and across situations. And the origins of personality basically is the sum total of these kind of enduring characteristics that differentiate one person from another. And the idea is that personality, or the beginnings of personality, begin in infancy. So let's move on to that. The idea here is that the foundation for personality is based out of what is called temperament. And temperament, here's a definition for what is meant by temperament. It's the pattern of arousal and emotionality that are consistent and enduring characteristics of an individual. So that there's a certain way in which people respond to the environment, respond to others, that begins in infancy. It's not fully formed, obviously, in infancy, but one can start seeing the beginnings, or let's say, the seeds or the roots of the eventual personality of individual. Temperament refers to how children behave, and that's a very important distinction. It's not necessarily the way they think. Temperamental differences, I should say, amongst infants appears from the time of birth. So we're talking about right from the very beginning. Temperament shows stability from infancy at least through adolescence. There's also the assumption, however, that this temperament continues well into adulthood. However, environmental factors can modify temperament. That's both in childhood as well as in adulthood. And I don't remember if we've already covered this or not. This is typical of me. When did I talk about this? Have I talked about this before? But the idea is that personality in adulthood, personality in adulthood can be modified, but it's through usually very traumatic or major circumstances or enduring circumstances, and or due to the very persistent kind of disciplined effort on the part of the adult individual to change certain aspects about themselves. There are 9 different dimensions to temperament. Some central dimensions include the anxiety level, what that means is the degree of overall I'm sorry, not anxiety level, I made a mistake there. Activity level, the degree of overall movement. So there are some children that tend to be, some infants, for example, that tend to be more physically active with the environment, while there are those other infants that seem to be more passive about the environment. Mood is another factor. This includes the nature and the quality of the mood. Particularly, irritability is an aspect that one starts to see differences in across infants. So irritability is particularly important and reflects the fact that certain infants are easier going, while others become more easily disturbed. So there's a combination of this. You can have a very proactive child who may be less irritable. You can have a more passive child who's more irritable or easygoing. And so you see this kind of mixture. Now, like I said, there are a number of dimensions to temperament, but we're only going to focus, or we're only going to cover briefly the ones that I just covered with you. Okay. Next, is categorizing, categorizing temperament. You'll see that there are certain ways in which temperament can be categorized, and we've already kind of hinted at that from the previous slide, with the idea of easy babies, difficult babies, slow to warm up babies. These are infants that tend to not engage as quickly when another person is interacting with them. And so these are kind of the overall broad, one way of broadly categorizing temperament with young babies, with infants. Easy babies tend to be have a more positive disposition. Their bodily functions operate regularly, and they are very adaptable. And this apparently is about 40% of infants. And I should say that this is based on a study done by Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess. And it's from their study called the New York Longitudinal Study from 1984. And they were the ones who came up with these kind of profiles. And I'm not sure if this is one of the first longitudinal studies to try to categorize the different kinds or types of temperament. That I'm not sure about, but it certainly was an influential study. Again, they started with this category of easy babies, and they figured estimated about 40% of the infants were that way. Difficult babies tended to have more negative moods. They were more slow to adapt to new circumstances. And when they were confronted with a new situation, they tended to withdraw. And that was about 10% of the infants. And then there's the third category, which is what they call the slow to warm up babies, who tended to be more inactive. They showed relatively calm reactions to their environment. Their moods were generally negative, however, and they withdrew from new situations, adapting very slowly. So they could be relatively inactive, relatively calm in environments that they were familiar with. But once they were put into new environments, then their moods tended to become more negative, and they tended to be more withdrawn from newer situations. And this was about 15% of the infants. And then the remaining 35% could not be categorized at all. Probably showed some kind of variation of these three that we've just mentioned. And you might want to think about how did your parents not categorize you, but describe you as an infant. And it might be interesting to see if maybe you might fit into one of these categories, or maybe you're uncategorizable. That's very possible. Now, the consequences of temperament, I mean, does this really matter, even for infants? And it's important to remember that no temperament, when researchers try to categorize or describe different types, either dimensions of temperament, as we mentioned earlier, or categories of temperament, such as this study, that none of these qualities or temperaments or dimensions are inherently good or bad. It's just the way infants tend to differentiate from each other. Long-term adjustment really depends on a concept called goodness of fit. And goodness of fit is a very important concept to social work, by the way. Goodness of fit, not only, although this is applied to infants in this case, social workers have used this notion of goodness of fit across the entire life cycle. But the idea is that development is dependent on the degree of match between a person's temperament, or in this case an infant's temperament, and the nature and demands of the environment in which they are being raised. So Some children might have temperaments that clash more with the environment within which they are being raised, and others children's temperament may fit, so to speak, better with what the demands of the environment might be. So, for example, some difficult children might be more likely to show behavior problems by school age than easygoing children, based on the fact that school situations often demand children to either follow certain structures or rules, or demand a child be faced with a lot of novelty over a rapid period of time. A key determinant also of goodness of fit is the way caregivers respond. There may be a poor goodness of fit between the personality or temperament of a parent with that of the infant. Again, the important another good example of this could be culture. Has a major influence. So, for example, you may have a child that is very proactive, that is more, let's say, more extroverted. We haven't really covered that idea of introversion or extroversion, and we'll get into that. And the child is a female child, but the female child lives in a culture where female children and women in general are supposed to be more passive, more withdrawn, and more compliant with the demands of the environment. So in this case, this could be a poor fit between the infant and the cultural demands. Again, this is an idea that could follow an individual throughout or across the life cycle, although goodness of fit here really pertains to infants and the environments in which they are raised. You know, the fit between the infant's temperament and the demands or style in which the environment, or I should say the characteristics of the environment in which the child is being raised. Now, there are different trait approaches to personality, and I said we would get into introversion, extroversion, and you could see the word extroversion or extroverted. Again, this is the idea of looking at personality as having multiple traits, or that there are multiple dimensions to personality. So this is the big 5 personality traits, although you see 6 of them here. No, I'm sorry, 5 of them here. I can't even count. It has nothing to do with personality traits, by the way. It just means I can't count. People have many traits or enduring dimensions of personality or characteristics that differ from person to person and that seem to carry across the person's life and across multiple circumstances. The trait approaches offer an alternative to the idea of Erikson's stage theory of psychosocial development, as well as psychodynamic perspectives. So we have Freud's ideas of psychosexual development. Then we have Erikson's idea of psychosocial development, which is we'll go into with some detail later on in this particular lecture. And then at the same time, there are those that said, no, what's really important to understand is that there are these kind of biological foundation to the way in which people interact with others, and that is what we call traits, and that there are several dimensions to traits. We just saw an idea of different categories for traits, or for temperament, I should say. This idea is that, in fact, there are multiple dimensions that a person can be rated on, let's say, and that depending on the environment, that is that goodness of fit, the individual will respond in a particular way, and there may be more opportunities or more challenges for the individual based on that goodness of fit. Basically, there are these big 5 personality traits. They're 5 broad dimensions that are used for trying to describe an individual's personality. And everyone's rated on all of these, I might add. It's not that whether one is neurotic versus one is agreeable. It's that a person, one individual, can be rated on all of these dimensions. So, for example, openness. Openness refers to the level of curiosity about and interest in new experiences. Is one relatively more open or closed to new experiences? Is one relatively more interested or disinterested to novel or new experiences? Conscientiousness refers to the tendency to be organized and responsible. Extroversion deals with how outgoing or shy a person. So again, we have introversion versus extroversion, and there's this kind of mapping that you can place. Where does somebody seem to fit in that range from the most introverted to the most extroverted, let's say? Agreeableness, we've already talked about this earlier when we were talking about categories about infants. Agreeableness is how easygoing and helpful a person tends to be. And then neuroticism, it deals with the degree to which a person is either moody, anxious, and self-critical. So non-neurotic to very neurotic. High neuroticism versus low neuroticism. High extroversion versus low extroversion, or high introversion in that case. Okay? So let's see here. This kind of mapping is meant to try to identify the dimensions of personality. And then once we've identified these dimensions and where a person kind of fits or maps on these dimensions of personality, the idea is then how stable is the individual based on the way they've been mapped, quote unquote, or assessed on their overall personality. There are some changes in personality, or in traits, I should say, in childhood and in adolescence. We can see that. Relative to adults, adults tend to be more stable in their personality traits than children and adolescents. However, even with children and adolescents, research shows that it's relatively stable across time. It just means that they're a bit more malleable than adults. Perceptions of changes, let's say if others feel like another person's personality or traits have changed, this perception of changes may be attributable to different behavioral manifestations, I should say, of the same particular constellation of traits or developmental periods. That is to say that sometimes we may see more agreeableness in the same individual and less agreeableness in individual. That is to say that being extroverted has multiple ways of being expressed. So maybe a child was more extroverted in a particular way, but now as they've gotten older, they're more extroverted in another particular way that seems to be different from what they were before. Now, personality and genetics and the environment, traits are related to temperament. They are not the only personality characteristics affected by heredity. Behavioral geneticists and evolutionary psychologists believe that there is a combination of inherited genes that determines a person's personality, much the way there are multiple genes that are involved with the height or the eye color or the shape of the eye that for an individual. That is, this is polygenetic. There are multiple genetic components. There's not just one gene for extroversion, let's say. There are multiple genes. There may be hundreds of genes that are involved just with one range or one dimension of a particular trait, I should say. Evolutionary arguments hypothesize that personality traits are beneficial, or have in the past were beneficial to survival and reproductive success, and therefore are more likely to be maintained and passed on to subsequent generations. The idea about evolutionary psychology is that the psychological aspects of an individual, or the different aspects of psychology that we see in the human species, probably had some, at least thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago, had some evolutionary advantage. There may have been a good reason for people to be, as we call, neurotic or anxious, for example. Maybe those who were more sensitive to any changes in the environment were more likely to flee. Now, maybe they, when they perceived a danger to be present, now maybe they fled more often than they needed to, but you know those few times when it really needed to happen, that is, they really needed to flee, it worked. And so, therefore, that quality of being more attentive to the environment, even more hypervigilant to the environment, may have had an evolutionary advantage for individuals, and therefore they survived, and therefore they were able to pass on those kind of genetic character qualities to future generations. So this is what they're talking about. Studies of identical twins, remember we talked about the importance of identical twins previously. When identical twins are raised apart, this illustrates the importance of heredity in personality development. So some traits do have strong genetic components. One of those is the extroversion-introversion. That really seems to be an aspect of an individual, that activity level. We first see it in activity level with infants, and then we start to see in more proactivity, and then more interactivity, I should say interpersonal interactivity, versus those who tend to be perhaps maybe less active, more passive. You know, not as warm to warm up, let's say, not as quick, I should say, to warm up to interacting with others. Other traits may have weaker genetic components, such as the amount of achievement or a sense of social closeness. Yes, there are people who have hypothesized that these could be personality traits, achievement, high achievement level versus those who have, low motivation for achievement, etc. And these are probably have minor or have a stronger environmental component. Environmental influences also have a significant effect on the consistency of traits throughout the life cycle. So there are certain environmental or cultural norms that can reinforce certain traits while also clashing with other traits. Remember, we were talking about goodness of fit. So even for the same individual, around the same dimension of personality, let's say, there may be aspects of that, let's say about extroversion, introversion on that scale or dimension. There may be aspects about the environment and the social and the culture where there's a real goodness of fit, but then in other normative circumstances within the environment or the culture, there may be a poor fit at that time. So even in the same dimension, we can see these kind of differences. Let's see. Also, we should remember that inherited traits are not only influenced by the environment, but they influence the environment. The individual is not a passive character in the play of life, shall we say. The individual does impact the environment, and there are studies that show that even at infancy, that even infants have an impact on their environment in some way. And obviously, as somebody gets older and as we move into adulthood, that influence on the environment becomes greater and more significant. But even at infancy, we have some impact on our environment. So the way in which our temperament may be will impact the environment. Again, this gets back to goodness a fit. Maybe the environment welcomes that kind of activity or kind of responsiveness and therefore reinforces it, or may not. Or, maybe parents who were tended to be more introverted, let's say, and they wind up having a child that's extroverted, may become more extroverted as a way of, accommodating their, very active child. Temperament and traits are not destiny, however. I want to make that clear. Some individuals do show more change over time in their temperament than others. Although overall, in broad strokes, if we're talking about on average, most people's temperament and overall personality tends to stay rather stable. But even in that grand generalization that I've just made, there's a spectrum. So there are those who are much more stable over time, and there are those who are much more fluid in their personality over time. So we see differences there as well. That is, we see differences in, this is my term, fluidity of personality. Okay? Okay. So that's really a basic introduction to the idea of personality, that what influences how an individual develops psychologically is heavily based on temperament, traits, or a combination of temperament and traits that then kind of are realized in this kind of fully formed idea of a personality. With Erikson, his idea was that the way people develop psychologically is through the interpersonal relationships they have starting from infancy through the entire life cycle, and that this is what impacted what a person would be like as far as their personality was concerned, how they interacted with the world, etc. Erikson's theory, Erikson argued that personality is largely shaped by infants' experiences with other people. And not just infants, I might say, but throughout the life cycle. That was something that he was, I'm going to backtrack here and say he was psychodynamic. He did accept Freud's psychosexual stages. When he developed these psychosocial stages, he believed that he was adding to what Freud had already done. Okay, so he didn't reject it. He didn't see this as in competition to Freud's psychosexual stages. He saw this as an additional, as kind of a fleshing out or kind of fleshing out of Freud's original ideas to include not only the intrapsychic, psychosexual, libidinal processes that Freud talked about, but also the kind of the psychosocial, the interpersonal relationships that people had. So this is in stark contrast to the idea, and Freud also believed this as well, that personality developed through these kind of psychosexual stages, Erikson's psychosocial stages. Now we're going to spend, although this is just a brief introduction, I might add, and a brief overview of Erikson's ideas, we are spending a little bit more time on Erikson's ideas than Freud's psychosexual stages. Why? Because Erikson's ideas continue to be very influential, particularly for social work. Freud, of course, was very influential on American social work or U.S. social work, particularly from around the 1920s through about the 1950s, 1960s, that waned, and Erikson's ideas came along, I think, in the 40s or 50s, if I remember correctly, 50s and 60s actually, and these kind of not supplanted, but became even more influential for social work and continue to be influential. So that's why I thought it would be important to spend a little bit more time with reviewing Erikson. Erikson has 8 distinct stages that begin in infancy and go throughout the entire life cycle. Okay, so why don't we start with infancy? Okay, the first stage that he developed was what he called trust versus mistrust. And this is from birth to about 18 months of age. What he means by this trust versus mistrust, you'll see that each stage has this versus that. This is the psychosocial task, the psychological interpersonal task that an individual must accomplish in order to fully develop their personality and their sense of self and their sense of psychological well-being in the world. Okay, so you're going to see that there's, each stage we have this kind of something versus something else. So for example, with the first stage, infants need to develop a sense of trust versus mistrust. And that this is done largely, their ability to do this is largely dependent on how well their needs are met by their primary caretakers. So the relationship that an infant has is primarily with its primary caregivers, typically one or two people, particularly in the West, here in the United States. We have one or two people that are involved with the caring of the infant. If the infant develops trust, then later on in life, they experience a sense of hope about their future, and that because they believe that their needs will be met. So this is a very foundational psychological task that needs to occur. Mistrust, however, if an infant primarily develops mistrust about the environment, this will lead the infant to see the world as unfriendly, as unstable, even harsh, and therefore later in life the child can have trouble forming bonds with others. Now when we talk about this trust versus mistrust, Erickson did not believe that one should be only trusting without mistrust. It wasn't all or nothing. It was that you wanted a child or the individual to have a preponderance of the positive aspect of the stage versus the negative. But you still wanted a little bit of that negative piece. So you don't want a child who's completely trusting of the environment. You still want the child to develop some sense of mistrust because, not everything in the environment is safe or benign. And so therefore it's important that the child have a certain sense of wariness about certain aspects of the environment while knowing what it can trust in the environment and seek protection or security or stability from. Okay? So it's very important to realize it. So we want a preponderance of the more positive aspect of the challenge that is faced at that particular stage. Okay, so the next stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this begins about 18 months of age and continues through about 3 years of age. Now, it's during infants and toddlers, I should say infants who enter into the autonomy versus shame/doubt stage. This is, according to Erickson, a time when toddlers develop either independence and autonomy, if they are allowed the freedom to explore, or shame and doubt if they are restricted and overprotected. And you'll see our little friend here. He's on a little tricycle. Autonomy literally means the sense of ability to become, the child develops an ability to become more mobile, physically mobile, therefore more independent of the primary caregivers. The scope of those who the young child, the toddler, will interact with now expands because the child is more mobile and really, literally more independent, physically more independent. And so therefore the child, this is the first attempts at autonomy for the individual. Parents who encourage exploration into the environment have children who feel safe within their boundaries. This is according to Erickson. But children who are overprotected by their, or overly restricted by their caregivers, will feel a certain amount of unhappiness and even shame about the desire to be more autonomous, and therefore develop a sense of self-doubt. Okay? Now, again, just as I said with the previous stage, you do want children to have a preponderance of a sense of autonomy, that they're able to go out and be more active and explore their environment, but you do want them to have a bit of self-doubt about their abilities, about dealing with novel circumstances. Because again, some novel circumstances may be good and positive, and some may be even dangerous for the child. And so you want the child to have a little bit of self-doubt while also having a preponderance, a sense of independence from this stage. Now, the next stage deals with ages, this is preschool, ages 3 to 6. And this is the stage for initiative versus guilt. Basically, this is the period during which children experience a conflict between independence of action and the sometimes negative results of the action. So the child is now not only independent, physically independent, but the child begins to have a sense of possibly the consequences of independence, not only on themselves, but also on others. And so, I was going to say Freud, Erikson believed that with parents' help, children can learn to be independent and begin to shape the kind of persons they will become by making good decisions about that autonomy. So it's not just a matter of going out and exploring the environment kind of for the first time and just seeing what's out there. It's now taking specific initiative, making specific autonomous choices, that a child learns what are good decisions versus bad decisions. Parents who discourage, however, a child's efforts to be independent, to take this initiative, may induce in their child a sense of lifelong guilt. This is according to Erikson. Okay, our next stage is industry versus inferiority. And this is, now we're getting into older children, school-age kids from the ages of 6 to about 12. According to Erikson, middle childhood really encompasses what he called this industry versus inferiority stage, which is characterized by a focus on efforts to attain a sense of competence in meeting the challenges presented by parents, by peers, by the school, and the other complexities of the modern world. Now, you'll notice that the social world of the child is now expanding even further. I forgot to mention in the previous stage that as a child starts to take initiative, they start to encounter even more individuals, maybe their peers, maybe neighbors, maybe preschool, etc. With this stage, 6 to 12, children are exposed to even more people, even more adults, more children. They're going out even more into the social environment, into their community now. So the circle of interpersonal possibilities for the child or for the individual extends even further. And you'll see this across the life cycle, that this circle expands further and further across the life cycle. So this deals with not only autonomy, not only taking initiative, but the sense of being industrious, if you will. It's kind of an old term, being productive. That not only is it a matter of being autonomous and taking initiative, but now meeting the demands of others and wanting to meet the demands of others and feel good about their accomplishments in meeting the demands and expectations of others, versus having a sense of inferiority that they're not capable of meeting these demands. This stage involves not only gaining more knowledge and many skills, but also making a niche for themselves in the social world. You know, children begin to start to understand what they may have more capabilities versus what they have less capabilities of, what talents they have versus maybe where they're less talented. And they want to be able to be productive to the social environment by offering their talents. Difficulties, according to Erickson, in this stage lead to feelings of failure and incapacity, a sense of inferiority. Children can withdraw from both academics and interactions with their peers due to this sense of inferiority. Again, we want a child, we want the individual to have a preponderance of feeling of being industrious, of being productive, of being able to provide or offer something to the social environment, but we don't want them to have too big a head on their shoulders, so to speak. We want them to have a certain sense of self-doubt, a certain sense of inferiority, that, you know, maybe they're not quite as good as they always think they are. It's true, they have some talents, but, you know, they still need to learn a few things along the way. Do you see what I'm saying? So you want a little bit of that other piece. It's not an all or nothing proposition. The next stage is actually the stage that Erickson spent the most time with, and I think he actually started with stage and then he worked backwards and then worked forward in the life cycle. He was really most interested in adolescence and earlier in his career. And so he focused a lot initially on adolescence. And then we'll see that others came along and even added to this stage of identity versus identity confusion. And this stage starts around the age of 12, around the beginning of puberty, and lasts until about the age of 20. Basically, Erickson believed that adolescents seek to determine what is unique and distinctive about themselves in comparison to others. So in the earlier stage, they're learning that they may have certain talents versus others. Now that expands further to say, well, what makes me as an individual distinctive from others beyond just a certain group of talents? At this time, adolescents explore a lot of roles. They sometimes narrow their choices. Sometimes they expand their choices. They can kind of go back and forth. We talked about this, that teens can fluctuate very rapidly, and that includes how they may identify themselves. Adolescents really use this time as a way to fully discover who they are as individuals. Adolescents who don't resolve this stage may find it difficult to form and maintain close relationships later in life simply because they don't know who they are. They don't know what they want. They don't know what they want from others because they don't know themselves that well. And they don't know what they want from circumstances because they don't know themselves that well. So that can interfere with their ability to make those kind of typical adult choices that are expected of adults in modern day society. The next stage, and you'll notice now with Freud, he ended at this age group, but Erickson moves it beyond now into adulthood. And we're looking at young adulthood. Now, when Erickson first came up with his ideas, he was talking about 20-year-olds to 18-year-olds to probably about 30. As we have talked about earlier in the semester, and I'll remind you throughout the rest of the semester, young adulthood has been expanded to now involve much of the 30s. We see this now with quite a number of 20-somethings who still live with their parents, and there's a whole host of different reasons why this is occurring. But the kinds of choices, vocational choices, romantic choices that people used to make by the age of 18 or 19, let's say 50 years ago, people have now postponed well into their 20s. So this stage is really, the age range has extended somewhat, in the last 20 years or so. Basically, for Erikson, he believed this was the period of post-adolescence that focuses on developing close relationships with others. Now, for Erikson, he was particularly interested in romantic relationships, that people now start to look for a romantic partner, a spouse, if you will, to marry, to settle down, to eventually have children. So this was kind of the model that he was using in his mind when he created, when he was talking about this this stage. Subsequent thinkers, theorists I should say, have said that it's not just about romantic or spousal choices, if you will, although it obviously includes that for young adults, but other interpersonal important relationships that include dear friends, how one relates to one's parents now that one is an adult. Everyone's an adult now. Let's say the parents are still adults, obviously, and now the child is an adult. So how does that relationship change and develop into something that is mutually beneficial and enjoyable and supportive between now the young adult and the parent? Anyway, according to Erikson, intimacy comprised several aspects, and you'll notice that we're switching back now to more spousal, intimate notion of relationships. It involves, according to Erikson, a degree of selflessness, sacrificing one's own needs to those of another, sexuality, that there is a joint pleasure from focusing not just on one's own gratification, but also to that of one's partner. There is a deep devotion or development of a deep devotion marked by efforts to fuse one's identity with the identity of the spouse. Erikson suggested that those who experience difficulties during this stage are often lonely and isolated, hence we've got the lonely, isolated aspect of this stage. The failure of a young adult to develop a spousal relationship, according to Erikson, may be due to earlier failures or interruptions in psychosocial development, earlier in life. So remember that Erikson's theory at this point really was focused on marriage, because at the time when he developed this, most people in this age range did marry. Remember 50 years ago, 60 years ago, we were still seeing marriage rates as high as into the 90 percentile. 90 to 95% of the population was getting married still at that point. Nowadays, of course, much of that has changed, so some post-Erikson theorists have expanded this to include a broader sense of intimacy and a broader sense of isolation. Now remember, it's important to have both of these, that a person can have intimacy with several people or with one person in particular, if it's a spouse, let's say, but also can tolerate a sense of isolation, a sense of loneliness, that they're not totally immersed in their spouse. Okay? It's still important to have a little bit of that more negative aspect of the stage. So now we move into middle adulthood, and this stage is generativity versus stagnation. This starts around the age of 40 and goes into about 65, 70. Erikson suggested that middle adulthood encompasses this generativity versus stagnation stage, during which people consider their contributions to their family, to their community, to their work and society. Now notice how the social environment has extended even further now. I forgot to mention with young adults, it does expand further, because now the person is looking for a broader range of people to interact with, possibly to meet a future spouse. Also gets involved with work environment, beyond school. So the social environment of the individual in young adulthood obviously extends, but in middle adulthood extends even further to include the idea of making contributions to future generations, not only to one's family, not only to one's to those the person loves and cares for, but also to the community, to one's job, to society in general. So this is the idea that generativity is a sense of guiding and encouraging future generations, that this is what middle adults who are able to successfully accomplish this stage will be able to have. That they'll have a sense of duty and feel positive about that in helping future generations. Generativity also involves seeking to leave a lasting contribution to the greater community and to the world. Generativity means looking beyond oneself to the continuation of one's life through others. And we see this, very interestingly, we sometimes see this with individuals who've made a great deal of money earlier in their life, and they make almost an abrupt change in their lives, a midlife career change, to something that is more, they would say, more meaningful, that is more socially productive, that maybe they were stockbrokers or they were corporate lawyers, and midlife they decide to change. They've made lots of money, and now they want to change the direction of their life so that they're actually giving back to the world based on what they've already earned. In some way, they give back to the world. Instead of just creating money for themselves or for the business that they work for, now they want to create kind of a lasting impact, a positive impact on their communities. I really feel that what Bill Gates did and his wife did, Bill Gates in midlife leaves Microsoft, and one of his major tasks now is this whole Bill Gates Foundation, where he's taking billions of dollars and using it to have a very positive impact on the general community. I think Erickson would call that highly generative. Okay. Stagnation, however, in this stage means people focus on the triviality of their lives and feel that they have made only a limited contribution to the world, that their presence has counted for little, that they feel that they have had a poor impact on future generations, maybe on their own children, on their own community, on their work environment. They feel like they're stuck, let's say. They've become stagnant. This is a very kind of interesting notion of generativity versus stagnation. Notice I also put a man here. I did this quite purposely for generativity. Generativity is not just about women feeling generative. We often associate that with women, but men also feel generative at this stage. A sense of even duty, a positive sense of obligation, shall we say, for a lasting contribution to their children, to their grandchildren, and to future generations. Okay. And then the last stage is ego integrity versus despair. And this starts around the age of 65, 70 to the end of life. He labeled this last stage of personality development ego integrity versus despair because he felt this was characterized by a process of looking back over one's life, evaluating it, reflecting on it, and then coming to terms with one's life, with the choices that one made earlier in life. Integrity, according to Erickson, comes when people feel they have realized and fulfilled the possibilities that have come their way, that they've made the most of life, to use a more kind of vernacular way of describing that process. Despair occurs, according to Erickson, when people feel dissatisfied with their lives and experiences. They experience a sense of gloom. Regret is probably a very powerful feeling. Despair, that maybe they wasted their lives in some way. So it's really a sense of, I did well. I think I did something. I'm going to leave something behind that is positive, versus those who feel that perhaps they wasted their time or wasted their lives. Again, we want to see a combination of this, more on the ego integrity aspect, but maybe there might still be some regrets because no one's perfect. But a person with high ego integrity would be able to tolerate that everyone has some regrets in their lives. And therefore, one expects that. Even there might be a sense of self-forgiveness, that one can say, you know what, I did make some bad choices earlier in life, and I understand that. You know, people do that. I'm not alone in that. I'm not unusual in doing that. So again, those are the Erikson stages, lifespan approach. As I said earlier, this has been enormously influential. It is generally supported by research overall. Some people have criticized it for having a more male-focused approach and a more Western-focused approach, in the sense that independence, autonomy, is productivity. These kinds of notions tend to have been at least traditionally associated with being male in a Western industrialized society. There's also been some research to show that not everyone passes through these stages in the order that he's posited. I will say one last thing about this is that Erikson tended to be a bit more optimistic about people's ability to go through these stages than perhaps Freud was about his psychosexual stages, and that it wasn't all or nothing. Somebody might not really complete a previous stage, but later in life would be able to go back in their own way and resolve those issues, while also working on the present demands, psychosocial demands of the stage that they're in at that point in life. Okay, that is our that's the end of the lectures for week 8. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week for lecture 9.